When one army retreats, another is usually advancing in pursuit. Well, unless you're George McClellan. But that's a Civil War joke for another day, I suppose. Because George McClellan has nothing to do with the Battle of Newmarket. Well, maybe he has something to do with it. But that would be a lot of discussion. And right now, I think we want to talk about how the Union Army got from the Bushong lines across the river to safety in Mount Jackson, and what the Confederates were doing while the Yankees were in retreat. Or something like that. Anyway, my notes say that we are supposed to be talking about the Union retreat to the Confederate advance at the Battle of Newmarket. So here we are. I am Sarah K. Byerly with Gazette 66.5, and I invite you to join me for a discussion of the closing hours on May 15th, 1864. Last week we focused exclusively on the role of the Virginia Military Institute cadets during the Battle of Newmarket. Go back and watch the video if you want to hear that discussion, see some footage of Newmarket battlefield as it appears in the modern era, and have a real focus on the VMI cadets. Because today I am going to tell you something. The Virginia Military Institute cadets did not single-handedly win the Battle of Newmarket. Right. There were other Confederate units that also advanced. And I did not make that statement to take anything away from the young men from the Institute who fought bravely, who made a charge that is history noteworthy. No question about that. But sometimes when we look at how the battle has been interpreted to, shall we say, pop culture ideas of Newmarket's battle, we sometimes might leave with the idea that the cadets single-handedly won the victory. And let's just put that aside. They did a very brave thing, but there were other Confederate units who also advanced and made charges. So let's talk about what forced the Union Army under Franz Sigel into their final retreat in this day of events near Newmarket. There's three main things that you can think about as deciding factors into forcing Sigel's army into retreat. Number one, the center. That's where the VMI cadets charge across what's now called Field of Lost Shoes, and they threaten Captain von Kiesler's Union artillery battery. They force him to pull the guns off the field. He abandons one gun, makes it off with four, and is sent into retreat. The infantry is not there to strongly support his guns, which is an interesting point. So point one, the center of the Union line is in big trouble. Point two, the Union right flank, that western side of the Bushong line, is also in big trouble. Remember Bushong Hill? This sloping prominence that overlooks Field of Lost Shoes, the Bushong Farm, and the Confederate line? Well, the Union had artillery guns positioned up there. And if you want the whole rundown of the Bushong lines for Union and Confederate, you can catch the video that focuses on that. But Carlin and Snow have artillery batteries up on Bushong Hill. And for a while, Gabriel Wharton's Confederates had been trying to attack and were threatening this position on Bushong Hill. The 54th Virginia in particular was trying to sneak around on the flank and get in to take or at least force these guns out of position. Now, as I mentioned in a previous video, the drop-off of the hill, which then cuts down to the Shenandoah River, was really impeding this flanking movement as it was being attempted. But as a forward movement is occurring along different stages, or different places, of the Confederate line, the 51st Virginia, the other Virginia regiments that are up there with them, they are able to push forward and capture 1 or 2 cannons up there, and also push the Union artillery and infantry units in that area into a retreat. So number 1, you have the center threatened. Number 2, you have the Union right flank threatened. And don't forget about the Union left flank. That's going to be number 3. Because as we talked about, the 54th Pennsylvania makes that charge. They get themselves into a bad position, confronted by Confederates who kind of rose up and surprised them. The Pennsylvania boys fall back, the Confederates advance, Confederate units down there start outflanking the Pennsylvanians. So, sorry to say, Franz Sigel, but the collapse was in some ways inevitable. The way the battle was fought, piecemeal, regiment by regiment, unconcerted attacks, as we see with the 1st West Virginia, the 34th Massachusetts, the 54th Pennsylvania, they are not working together very well. Some of that may have been caused by the weather, battle smoke, and lack of visibility, and a big part of it is going to fall to some leadership difficulties occurring within Sigel's high command. So with center, right, and left threatened, outflanked, and under attack, Sigel's line collapses. Interestingly, he does not filter the 12th West Virginia, which had sat in reserve most of the day. He does not filter them into the line to try to stem the breaking, and he still had units that were sitting at Rude's Hill, which was some miles away, and with the exception of 1 artillery battery, they do not come up and help in the fight or to prevent the retreat. Franz Sigel himself, who had been conspicuous on the battlefield, he had been going around earlier placing artillery, trying to direct his commands. He will actually leave the battlefield, and the 12th West Virginia Regiment will follow him off the field, leading to the question, was he thinking of establishing a new defensive line, but then just could not end up stopping the retreat? It's an interesting point to ponder as we think about Sigel, and it's a question that remains unanswered. There were moments of great bravery that occurred in the advance and retreat from Newmarket battlefield. And one incident that I really like to highlight is the history, the account of James Madison Burns. Now, if you are taking notes, write down this man's name, James Madison Burns. More people need to know about him. As the Union line is collapsing and his regiment is retreating, he realizes that the American flag, the national standard carried by his regiment, was in danger of being captured. So Burns rushes back into heavy enemy fire, and he brings the flag back to safety. Well, as he's doing that, he realizes that one of his comrades is badly wounded. So he brings the flag to safety, leaves it with other men of the regiment, and then he runs back into this heavy fire and carries his comrade also to safety. It took decades, but he would receive the Medal of Honor for his courage at the Battle of Newmarket. He is the only soldier to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery at the Battle of Newmarket. So remember his name, James Madison Burns. Now the Confederates kind of have a problem. You see, they push the Union line into retreat, but they've been fighting all day. They are wet, they are muddy, some of them are running low on ammunition, and now they have several miles to go to pursue this Union army that is in retreat. They have another problem. The Confederate cavalry is ineffective at this point. As we mentioned earlier in the video series, John Imboden, the able Confederate cavalry commander, had taken his units across Smith's Creek. We think he was attempting to make a double crossing of the creek and be able to go and burn the bridge at Mount Jackson, which would have been the Union retreat route across the Shenandoah River. He makes one crossing of Smith's Creek and is not able to cross again, or he decides not to cross. We do know from eyewitness accounts that John Imboden comes and has a conference with General Breckinridge in the Bushong Orchard as the retreat of the Union Army is being begun, and the Confederates are following up on that advantage. That means that Bowdoin and possibly some of his staff attempted to make the crossing and succeeded in coming across Smith Creek, but probably the current was too swift and the danger too great for him to bring hundreds of horsemen across again. So he conferences with Breckinridge, and they discuss what to do, because the cavalry is not going to take a part in this retreat. And that is something that was good for the Union, because if you have cavalry that is able to follow up a retreat like this, it can drastically increase the casualties and also really cut off retreat routes, just because horsemen are able to move much faster and secure those strategic positions like the bridges quicker than the infantry can march to get there. You have tired Confederates, you have a lack of Confederate cavalry, and that will give Sigel's army a chance to get away. Their chances are increased by Captain Henry DuPont, who brings his 6-gun battery into play to help guard the rear of the Union Army. Here's a video clip that we shot at one of his artillery positions explaining some of what he accomplished during this retreat. We're here on the southern side of Rude's Hill, the very southern side of Rude's Hill, and this is the third and final position that Captain Henry DuPont takes with his artillery during the retreat from the Battle of Newmarket. Now, Captain DuPont does something very innovative as he's leaving the battlefield of Newmarket, trying to provide some cover for the retreating Union Army. He divides his battery of artillery and has those guns do a leapfrog pattern from the various ridges as they're retreating. And this helps to provide some artillery cover for the army as it's moving. Directly behind the camera, so you can't see it, is Route 11, which was the Old Valley Turnpike. So he's providing protection along this as the Union Army retreats. I'm standing at Mims Bottom Bridge, or the bridge going into Mount Jackson, and this is the bridge that the Union Army burns as they're retreating from the Battle of Newmarket. As you can tell, it's very close to the roadway. This is Route 11, so the major road, Valley Turnpike, so definitely major road of transportation during the Civil War. Again, the Union troops, Henry DuPont to be exact, are going to burn this bridge to keep the Confederates from pursuing them as they retreat from the Battle of Newmarket. By the time the Confederates reach Rude's Hill and are overlooking Mims Bottom, which is the approximate mile of flat land between Rude's Hill and the Shenandoah River, the Confederates are exhausted. By the time they're into position, most of the Union Army has crossed the river and they're getting ready to fire the bridge, meaning burn the bridge. So, thanks to DuPont's efforts, fast-moving Yankee legs, Sigel and his army managed to escape across the bridge at Mount Jackson, which will be burned behind them. And they will seek safety at Mount Jackson and then continue their retreat farther down the Shenandoah Valley. Breckinridge, by the time his army gets to Rude's Hill, he realizes they're exhausted. The Union Army has slipped from his grasp, but it has still been a day of mission accomplished for Breckinridge. Let's find out why. Remember when we talked about the decision that Breckinridge had to make atop Shirley's Hill, and how he knew that he had orders from General Robert E. Lee to come east and join the Army of Northern Virginia? Breckinridge could now do that. He had forced Sigel into retreat, which means that the Shenandoah Valley could then be monitored and held by a smaller force and Confederate cavalry. So he was going to be able to take many of his units and go and join Lee as had been requested. So Breckinridge accomplished the objectives that he had for the day's fight, and in many ways the campaign's fight as well. Now, what about the Virginia Military Institute cadets? Where do they take a role in this pursuit-retreat scenario that we've been talking about? Well, Breckinridge actually pulls them out of the battle lines and out of the pursuit. He tells them, "Well done, Virginians, well done, men," and he does not instruct them or permit them to continue with the Confederate Army chasing the Union to Rude's Hill and beyond. So he pulls them out of the battle lines, tells them they've done their part, congratulates them, thanks them, and then insists that they rest, find food, and tend to their wounded. Losses at the Battle of Newmarket: at least 588 Confederate casualties were suffered, and then about 744 Union soldiers would also be casualties from the Battle of Newmarket. Now, when we use the term casualties, that refers to dead, wounded, and missing. So basically either unaccounted for or accounted for in a field hospital or grave. So not the heavy losses that you see at a battle like Antietam or Gettysburg, but as I've said before, Newmarket was not an Antietam, it was not a Gettysburg, but it was a very decisive battle in Shenandoah Valley history, and it played a major role in what happened both to the west in southwestern and western Virginia, and to the east with the Overland Campaign. It can be seen as a turning point battle in the strategy of the location, being the Shenandoah Valley. And if you think back to the words of General Thomas J. Jackson, who was one of the early Confederate defenders of the valley, he said, "If the valley is lost, Virginia is lost." And in some ways, that proves true, because as 1864 goes on and more Union campaigns and attacks happen in the Shenandoah Valley, the Confederates lose their grip on that important region. And as they're losing their grip on the valley, they're also losing their grip on other portions of Virginia. I'm Sarah K. Byerly with Gazette 66.5. Thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and come join us next week as we focus on civilians and memory of Newmarket Battle. I hope you have an inspired week. Thanks again, and take care.